Expanding his words slightly, I'd really appreciate the chance to discuss this with someone who can assist me properly. Ethan sighed heavily, clearly uninterested, and shook his head. Sir, this bank handles serious business. We don't really have time for. Before he could finish, another employee, a senior banker named Mr. Reynolds, stepped out of his office. He had a sharp eye for detail and had been observing the exchange. Unlike Ethan and Sophia, he recognized Christopher immediately. His eyes widened slightly before a professional smile graced his face. Mr. Christopher, what a pleasant surprise. Please come into my office, Mr. Reynolds said, his voice warm with respect. Ethan and Sophia exchanged puzzled glances as Christopher nodded politely and followed Mr. Reynolds. As he walked past, he caught the flicker of embarrassment in their eyes. He didn't say a word about their rudeness. He didn't need to. The contrast between their assumptions and reality was clear enough. Inside the office, Mr. Reynolds gestured for Christopher to sit. I must apologize for the treatment you received out there. Unfortunately, some people judge too quickly. Christopher simply smiled, shaking his head. I've learned that patience reveals the truth in time, he said calmly. Mr. Reynolds chuckled and nodded. Indeed. Now, tell me about the corporate account you'd like to open. And with that, the conversation took the professional and respectful turn it should have had from the beginning. The therapy sessions continued, each one peeling back layers of unexamined biases that Amanda and Patrick hadn't even realized they carried. Patrick, who had always considered himself fair and neutral, found himself confronted with uncomfortable truths. During one session, an older man named Mr. Johnson shared a story eerily similar to Christopher's, how he had been turned away from a bank despite being more than qualified for the services he sought. The emotions in the room were heavy, and Patrick couldn't ignore the growing weight in his chest. For the first time, he saw his past actions in a different light. The dismissive looks, the skeptical tone, the refusal to even glance at Christopher's documents. It wasn't just following policy. It was something deeper, something uglier. One evening, after a particularly intense session, Amanda sat in her car for a long time before driving home. She replayed Christopher's words in her head. This is an opportunity, a chance for you to see the world through a lens you've been avoiding. She realized now that she had been avoiding it, clinging to the belief that because she wasn't actively racist, she was in the clear. But racism wasn't just about overt hatred. It was about the subtle ways people were excluded, dismissed, and devalued. By the final session, both Amanda and Patrick had changed in ways they never expected. They weren't perfect, but they were aware now. They saw things they hadn't seen before, and more importantly, they wanted to do better. A week later, Christopher returned to the bank. This time, he was met with a very different reception. Amanda and Patrick, standing side by side, greeted him with a warmth that had been absent before. Mr. Christopher, Amanda said, her voice steady but sincere. We owe you an apology. A real one. Patrick nodded. And we'd like to personally assist you with your corporate account. If you'll allow us. Christopher studied them for a long moment. He could see it. The shift in their eyes, the weight of understanding that hadn't been there before. With a slow, knowing smile, he extended his hand. I appreciate that, he said simply. The past couldn't be undone, but the future? That was still being written. Based solely on his appearance, Patrick's journey was no less impactful. His natural defensiveness made the first few sessions difficult. He was quick to interrupt, to justify his actions, to point out times when he believed he had been fair to everyone. But as the sessions progressed, his walls began to crumble. One day, the therapist asked the group to participate in a role reversal exercise. Patrick was paired with a black man named Harold, who played the role of a banker, while Patrick acted as the customer. Harold treated Patrick with the same coldness and disdain that Patrick had often shown to others, adding an air of condescension that hit Patrick like a punch to the gut. That's what it feels like, Harold said afterward, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. That's what so many of us feel every day, like we're less than just because of the color of our Skin Patrick couldn't speak for the first time. He felt the sting of prejudice, even if only in a simulated environment. It was a wake-up call he couldn't ignore. Over the next several weeks, Amanda and Patrick began to change, not just in how they viewed the world, but in how they saw themselves. They started to recognize their privilege, their blind spots, and the harm they had caused both intentionally and unintentionally. The therapy sessions were difficult and often uncomfortable, but they were also deeply transformative. Christopher, though not directly involved in the sessions, kept tabs on their progress. He received weekly reports from the program's facilitators and even attended a few group sessions as a silent observer. Seeing Amanda and Patrick's vulnerability and willingness to change filled him with a sense of cautious hope. When the therapy program concluded, Amanda and Patrick requested a private meeting with Christopher. They walked into his office, their postures humble, their expressions earnest. "Mr. Reynolds," Amanda began, her voice trembling, "we owe you an apology, not just for how we treated you that day, but for the attitudes and biases we've carried for so long." The therapy opened our eyes to things we didn't want to see about ourselves. "We were wrong, so wrong, and we're so sorry." Patrick nodded, his usually confident demeanor replaced with genuine humility. "I thought I understood people, but I didn't. I judged you without knowing anything about you, and worse, I justified it to myself. Thank you for not giving up on us, even when you had every reason to." Christopher looked at them for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then, with a small smile, he said, acknowledging, "Your mistakes is the first step, but the real work begins now. Change isn't about words, it's about actions. Show me and yourselves that you've learned from this." Amanda and Patrick nodded, their resolve evident. Several months later, Christopher decided to host a small gathering at the bank to celebrate the progress Amanda and Patrick had made. It was a simple affair, just a few employees, some snacks, and a chance to reflect on the journey they had all been a part of. During the gathering, Amanda and Patrick shared their experiences with the group, speaking openly about their past mistakes and the lessons they had learned. Their vulnerability inspired others in the room to reflect on their own bias and behaviors, sparking a candid and meaningful conversation about diversity and inclusion. Christopher watched with pride as his employees engaged in the discussion, their words filled with empathy and a genuine desire to create a more inclusive workplace. It was a far cry from the hostility he had faced on his first visit to the bank. Toward the end of the evening, Amanda and Patrick approached Christopher. "We wanted to thank you," Amanda said, her eyes shining with sincerity, "not just for giving us a second chance, but for teaching us what leadership really means. You didn't just tell us to change, you showed us how." Patrick added, "You believed in us when we didn't deserve it. That's a lesson I'll carry with me for the rest of my life." Christopher smiled, his heart full. "The best way you can thank me is by continuing to grow and by helping others do the same." Change doesn't stop here. The events at the bank became a turning point, not just for Amanda and Patrick, but for the entire institution. Christopher implemented new diversity and inclusion training programs, ensuring that all employees, from entry-level staff to top executives, understood the importance of empathy and respect. Amanda and Patrick became champions of these initiatives, using their own experiences as a powerful example of how change is possible. They mentored new employees, shared their stories at company events, and worked tirelessly to create a workplace where everyone felt valued. For Christopher, the journey had been about more than just addressing a single incident of discrimination. It had been about planting seeds of change, about showing that even the most deeply ingrained biases could be overcome with humility, education, and a willingness to grow. And in the end, the greatest reward was
Seeing those seeds bear fruit, a team.
United by respect, a workplace. Transformed by understanding, and a legacy of leadership that would endure for years to come.